the City of Tallahassee Ethics Board. We are going to skip this introduction thing and go straight to approval of the minutes. Looking first at the minutes for January 15th. Does anyone have any questions, corrections, edits?
Nope.
Seeing none, Mr. Smith moves and Ms. McNeil seconds. All in favor say aye. Aye. The minutes are approved. The next minutes were for the meeting that we had a week ago on February 7th. Any edits, corrections, additions? Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
I did make one technical revision that was brought to my attention by our friends, the advocates, and then I think I corrected one other thing, but it was just minor typo.
Okay, so technical edits.
Technical edits only.
Okay, no other comments. Ms. Graham moves the minutes, and Mr. Payne seconds. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Those are approved. That moves us to item 3. We are in a procedural quagmire for the moment. Dr. Bouchon advised us today that he is no longer on the board. He, as we all know, moved to this area very recently, and as an ex-law enforcement officer, his address does not appear in various records, and so the normal things that would have caught this did not. He figured out that he is outside the city limits and therefore not qualified to sit on the board. So we have that vacancy, and I believe that a letter will go out today to the public defender seeking a new appointment. At our last meeting, we had a bare quorum of 4. Dr. Bouchon's attendance would not count because I believe that his appointment to the board is void, not voidable. So because he did not legally qualify to sit on the board, so any decisions we made at the last meeting don't count, which means that we are going to have to go back and do some legal work before our next meeting to see what those decisions meant. It may be that we are back to ground zero to the list of 21 possible board applicants for the board to consider for the vacancy and 10 applicants for board attorney, or it may be that either or both of the decisions that were made at that point have some validity. That's going to require some legal research, which we have not had time to do in the last 2 hours. So I'm going to just make an executive decision that the board attorney that we selected at the last meeting, regardless of how this plays out, is going, and he has agreed, he is going to sit with us and advise us until we make until we get through this procedural part. So he will be here with us today and at the next meeting giving us good advice. In terms of the appointment, item 3 on the agenda, which is the nominee for the 6th seat, we had invited the 4 people who were the most selected group from the 21, from the 4 of us who were there last week, but that's, again, doesn't count. We had asked them to be prepared to speak. We have, again, made a legal decision that since we may have to come back and reopen it to all 21, that if we give the 3 of you an opportunity to speak today, that may be perceived as putting our thumb on the scale in favor of you and in opposition to other people who the board may wish to talk to. So I'm going to beg your forgiveness, and we will have on our next agenda something about selection of a member for that vacant seat, and you are certainly welcome to attend, and of course, you're always welcome to make whatever public comment you may have, but I am not going to call on you today because we are not going to proceed with the selection of that board-appointed vacancy. So my apologies to Ms. Atkins, Mr. Owen, Ms. Gruel, and Mr. Kelly, who I think could not be here anyway since he is in the air at the moment. I flipped 3 and 4. I apologize for that. Are there any questions about all of that little monologue? Okay, seeing none, Again, these are items that the board members should not talk to each other about in between board meetings. You are certainly free to talk to our, acting board attorney and to the what do we call him? Not executive director. Ethics officer, thank you. My brain went blank for a moment. Too many words have flowed out of my mouth. To speak with either of them, and they can keep you up to speed, but we will be taking a look at what to do. At a minimum, we would need to, because our last meeting was appropriately noticed but didn't have a quorum, at a minimum, we would have to fully rediscuss and redo any decision that was made there, I believe. This is just me speaking. And at a maximum, we might have to simply start over on those decisions. But that's a matter of public meetings, public records. And also, I want to be courteous to the two members who were not there at the last meeting and make sure that they have a full voice in those decisions. So that plays into it regardless of Florida's laws on public meetings and public records. Okay, I think everybody understands where we are. We are kind of in a holding pattern. Again, I apologize to the three people who came at our invitation. Next time I'll bring you a snack to make up for it. That puts us on item 5, the ethics officer report. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, the first, and we go through these one at a time. There are individual components to this report. The first item is the summary of your activities. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's fine.
This is my report of my activities since our last meeting, and actually our last meeting was just last week. So actually it's the report since our last regular monthly meeting. So in addition to having the meeting last Thursday and the preparation for that, you'll see the other activities that I engaged in, and something new that's been started in the last few months is targeted ethics education to all city staff, and that includes part-time employees. So in this particular case, I did ethics education for people that are going to be lifeguards over the summer, for people that are going to be coaches for the baseball team. So the city's made a concerted effort to make sure that everyone doing a city job receives ethics education, and they receive it from the ethics officer. So that's a great opportunity to get out and meet all segments of the community and people that are doing everything. And it sort of highlights the need for more targeted ethics education for many segments of the workforce. So for example, lifeguards don't need the same ethics education as a city commissioner. But equally important that everyone follow the law and city policy and procedures. And there have been commission meetings. Last night there was a public hearing on the location of the public safety complex. That was a very well-attended, spirited meeting. And there'll be another one actually tonight starting at 6 o'clock. Probably no one here on this dais will make it. But what we're going to be doing going forward is when I attend these meetings, what you're going to see is what I learned at the meeting that's applicable to this board and its work. So in addition to seeing where I've been, you're going to see what I got out of it that'll be useful for you all. And then the other activities are things that are kind of usual orders of business for me.
Okay, any board member questions of Ms. Meadows-Keefe on this item? And I apologize, Mr. Betzine, I'm going to jump back to item 3 because it sort of fits there. I did not have the appearance cards in a very good order here. You had wanted to talk about the selection of the board council, and I think this would, at the beginning of the meeting here, since I just announced our re-looking at things, this would be an appropriate time for your comments. I apologize for jumping ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Peter Butzine. I reside at 1628 Woodgate Way, and I'm speaking before you today on behalf of the Coalition for Ethics Reform. Since the creation of this board over 4 years ago, our coalition has supported its role. We've worked to implement its mandate, and we've championed passage of a stronger ethics ordinance. During those years, we have defended the board, responding to criticisms from those who have challenged the board as being too costly and ineffective. Your special meeting on February 7th provided a unique opportunity to demonstrate whether the ethics board was up to the challenge, and we were extremely disappointed that at this abbreviated meeting on February 7th, the board missed its opportunity to engage the services as its counsel, Phil Claypool, who clearly is the most qualified person in the state for that position. And Mr. Reed, I want to say that we mean you no disrespect, but we believe that your qualifications for the office fall short of what is needed to provide counsel at this critical juncture in the board's history. We can't help but wonder that if the most experienced members had attended that meeting on the 7th, there might have been a very different outcome. But regardless, it's now apparent that decisions from the February 7th meeting are void due to a lack of quorum. Therefore, you have the opportunity to make it right the second time around. And why is this moment so important? It's because we have a fresh majority of commissioners who have campaigned on the issue of restoring integrity to our city's government. A key provision of the charter amendment, which created this board, states the ethics board shall, and I emphasize shall, assist the city commission in the development of an ethics code. Regrettably, it's an opportunity which the previous commission ignored. But the newly elected commissioners have promised that they look forward to receiving and acting upon the board's recommendations for a strong, enforceable ethics ordinance for the city of Tallahassee. So will this board demonstrate its commitment to restoring integrity rather than being complacent with the status quo? We are pleased that you will have another opportunity to select legal counsel. Your decision should be made not on the basis of connections and friendships or even on the billable rate, but on the qualifications of the applicants. And we further suggest that the applicant pool for counsel and the board member be expanded to include all applicants. We reiterate our strong support for Mr. Claypool. As former head of the Florida Commission on Ethics, he is most familiar with Chapter 112's weaknesses, and he can help overcome those weaknesses by helping you prepare the model ordinance that Tallahassee deserves. It could indeed become an example to all local governments in Florida. His expertise uniquely qualifies him to assist your preparing the kind of strong local ethics code that we envisioned when we worked to pass the Ethics, Anti-Corruption, and Campaign Finance Charter Amendment in 2014. We believe he clearly is the most qualified of the candidates that were considered at the February 7th meeting. So this is a make or break moment that will define the board's effectiveness and willingness to fulfill what 67% of Tallahassee voters demanded when they voted for the charter amendment in 2014. You have the opportunity to create a model for ethics reform, and we hope that you will not fail the voters of Tallahassee.
Okay, any board members have any questions for Mr. Butzine? I would like to, based on those comments, I would like to suggest to the board, if you are willing to allow me to move forward with this, that at least as to the drafting of when we draft our recommendations to the City Commission, we will include draft ordinances, that we, at a minimum, hire Mr. Claypool as a consulting attorney for the purposes of drafting them. So we would still use the board counsel that we have at the moment. We would still use any board members who can participate, and our ethics officer, that we, specific to that issue, bring Mr. Claypool in. I do not know if he would be willing to do that, but I think that particularly given those comments and Mr. Claypool's background, it would be an opportunity to guarantee that we dot the I's and cross the T's.
Should I reach out to him, Mr.
Well,
Chair?
let's see what the board members have to say about that.
I agree.
Okay, I'm seeing general nods of consent, so I'm not going to do that as a motion. Just, I think the attorney thing is not a, normal procurement, and this is, at a minimum, this would be a one-time opportunity. But yes, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, if you would reach out to him and suggest that we would love to have him work with us at this. I think we all agree it's a critical stage here in our recommendation.
If I could just respond.
Please.
I think that would be probably the least thing that this board would do. I would also point out, however, that Phil has written countless advisory opinions. He's engaged in findings of probable cause. He has administered the quasi-judicial proceedings of the Florida Ethics Code, and I think he would do more than simply should be more than involved in the preparation of an ideal ethics code, but instead should also, or would certainly serve this board well in any issues or complaints that come before the board in the future.
Okay, so Ms. Meadows-Keefe, when you talk to him just about a generic consulting role on those issues where particularly his expertise in the state code, because I know a number of our recommendations do track the Chapter 112 ethics provisions, and he would bring a level of expertise
and
that none of
Mr.
us.
Chair, we did, I think, in last time also discuss using Mr. Claypool as an advocate. If we get additional prosecutions down the road, that he could also be utilized in that way. It's important for the board to have a pool of people that can serve in those roles. So through working with different counsel, we've identified some of those individuals.
Okay, so you Ms. Meadows-Keefe, will come back to us at the next meeting with a report, and we can then make a real board decision. We're just directing her to move forward at this point without the board actually taking a formal vote.
Mr. Chairman, did I follow up his comment?
Yes, sir. Dr. Jackson, you recognize.
Irwin Jackson, 1341 Jackson Bluff. Philip Claypool, I want to strongly encourage you to use his full potential. We have someone you selected, but I can tell you, Mr. Claypool, 6 or 7 years ago, worked for me in putting together the ethics draft that I gave to the previous ethics commission, the city commission, and it was very thorough, it was very firm, and it was immediately thrown out by Scott Maddox and his friends. Okay? That says a lot about why we need Philip Claypool. Second thing, I read the information on the person that got selected. One thing we do not need on this board, with all due respect that people make their living off of lobbying, is now to have an attorney who generates a significant amount of his money by lobbying for different organizations. We don't need a lobbyist. Here we have someone, Philip Claypool, that won't have that conflict. That's one thing. Second thing, no lobbyist. Third thing, I'm not for sure where you're at with making your suggestions to the city. But what I'm trying to get the city commission to do, I'm over in Mariana and working, and I get a local newspaper, and I see that we have city employees shaking down nonprofit organizations. I say, shoot, only in Tallahassee. How embarrassing for me over there, how embarrassing for anyone in Tallahassee. Well, the girl who actually made that decision, bless her heart, sees this going on at the city, at the higher level. If Fernandez can get free tickets, and if this guy could get free tickets, and if the city commissioners want free tickets, the fact that she wrote a memo saying, yeah, we're going to fund you, but send us some free tickets for the commissioners and our staff. I would strongly encourage you, as I've been talking with commissioners, and I think they're going to buy off on it, but if you would recommend it, and it doesn't have to be thrown together with everything else, but have a zero tolerance for anything free. I talked with the city manager and had him explain to me how he got $350 tickets from boosters reduced down to $99. Now, everyone understood that was a joke, but he was serious. So, make it zero. If you don't own what someone gives you, then don't take it. Is it $5? I don't care if it's a bottle of water. If you didn't pay for it, don't take it. Then we don't have to worry about calculating the value. The zero is zero. And I think that would be a clear message from this board to the City Commission, and I think the City Commission is waiting for that kind of leadership. That is the ruling in the ethics policy that I paid to have put together and had some input, exactly what we came up with when Philip Claypool was involved. So don't weaken it down. Don't have him as a consultant. Don't have him with a number of other people. He is special. He's very knowledgeable, and he'll stand up for the citizens of this community, and that's what we need. And for several of us who've been involved with this for 4 or 5 or 6 years, I think you ought to listen to us on this one thing. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Jackson from the members? Yes, please, you recognize.
I just felt the need to correct the record. First and foremost, I just want to thank each of you for coming out and voicing your opinion. I, of course, take no exception to the comments that you make, and I appreciate your passion on the issue of ethics. It's a passion that I share. And I know that Phil Claypool is an exceptional individual, an exceptional lawyer, so I agree with you in that assessment. I just felt the need. I needed to correct the record. I'm registered to lobby one organization, that is the town of Greenville, for which I'm the town attorney, and that's simply so I could talk to legislators about some issues, particularly that we're dealing with our school district over in Madison County, but that's currently the only quote-unquote lobbying client that I have, but I wouldn't really say that's a lobbying client. It's more just to make sure I'm doing everything ethically possible for the legislature to ensure that I'm able to continue as the town attorney there and be effective as the representative. So, thank you.
Okay, and I would point out for the members that the material that was just referred to by Dr. Jackson that was drafted by Mr. Claypool was in the materials that was sent to everybody. So I think you've all had a chance to see that, and it is a lengthier and pretty comprehensive document. The next, the next item on the agenda is, and we're back on the Ethics Officer report, and this is the monthly tracking issues. There are 2 of these that I am going to handle. The first one, 155, relates to a complaint that, let me read what it says here. An individual claims staff jeopardized the individual's well-being by providing guidance. Individual also claims staff violated the public records laws. I did some looking in public record available materials. This involves a request from the complainant through a private social network on the weekend seeking advice on starting a consulting business to a public employee, advice from a public employee. Public employee responded on a subsequent weekend via the same private social network with comments about certain types of speech that would not help in starting a consulting business in Tallahassee. That response was 17 words long. The complainant took offense at the advice and the wording of the advice and filed this complaint, along with, that I'm aware of, numerous other complaints in other forums, and has now republished that 17 words of advice numerous times and claimed injury therefrom. The complaint says that the advice given is a violation of the city ethics code and that the public employee's use of a private social network violates public records laws. Neither element of the complaint is within the legal jurisdiction of this board. As you know, our jurisdiction applies primarily to the 9 elected and appointed city officials in terms of misuse of position and to some things, some ethical violations related to gifts. There's no element of this particular complaint that triggers anything within the city ethics ordinance which defines our jurisdiction. So, any questions? You're recognized. you please identify yourself?
My name is Benjamin Alexander Thaddeus John Horbovi. I am the complainant, and I wonder if the technical adjustment to the minutes was just that, because right here it just says individual claims staff jeopardizes individual well-being by providing guidance. Individual also claims violation of public laws. You just read something much longer. I have a little letter.
By the way, that's not the minutes, so there were no technical adjustments to that.
Okay. If I may, I'd like to read this, please. I prepared it. Tallahassee, forgive me for coming last time unprepared. I spoke at the City Commissioners Retreat from my heart without a planned speech. Thank you for coming out tonight. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. I appreciate that. Today, I woke up early, and after meditation in the prayer garden, I prepared a short and sweet statement. Normally, where I live is very quiet, but today there was dozens of loud trains, construction, barking dogs, screeching hawks, and wind blowing like a tornado. Interesting, last night was the brightest moon of the year. Witches are real, and they shimmer in fear when God's light shines off of his children. The devil tried to distract me, but I said, not today, Satan, not today. Today, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I want this to be clear. Do not let the words in one ear and out the other. I have a message for you. My grandpa and my dad have a message for you. My Polish grandpa was a Holocaust victim and a runaway slave from a Nazi death camp. My American grandpa fought Nazis in World War II, and my dad defected communist-occupied Poland and came to USA in 1976 as a legal political refugee. And I stand before you as a defender of faith and liberty. I am the only son of two chaplains. God is love. His son, who lives in the hearts of others, said to us, for those who believe in me will follow, and together we will drive out the demons from our community. Jesus, I trust in you, but all others remain suspect. Last time I came to this podium, I didn't know I would be speaking that day. And everything I said, I stand for. And no, I will not take it back because I meant it. I learned my lesson, though, about Tallahassee mud puddle, ridiculous politics. I said the Serenity Prayer for the community and wished you all wisdom and success. After I mentioned I was pro-liberty, pro-Second Amendment, pro-religious freedom, and that I have honor our president's leadership, I said I love you all, and this is not a red team versus blue team. This is about fresh green growth and unity. One love. I am here to help Tallahassee. I wish to listen with an open heart and contribute with compassion. I am here to grow smart communities with my nonprofit startup, smartflorida.org. Apparently, those words went against the local establishment's status quo. I was chased into the parking lot that day by the same man who came before you and said, let somebody on the board who doesn't agree with you. Later that week, on Sunday morning, I was sitting in church. I received a social media private message from a public official, not on public access email, may I add, saying that coming to Tallahassee with hate speech is no way to grow a business. I felt this was a threat. When I filed an ethics violation against the bully, Miss Julie Meadows Keefe, the city ethics officer, I politely asked for her to resign. Her one job was to make sure that the players in local politics played the game by the rules. How many criminal charges have the politicians racked up under her oversight? How many ethic boards do we have to replace this month because of her negligence to duty? I can't leave Tallahassee alone. The game needs me. It ain't easy being a truth teller in this town, but here I am. I found out today's hearing was from the newspaper. The response I got from the ethics officer was 2 sheriffs with SUVs serving me with an attempted injunction requesting the courts to ban me from public hall town meetings. Cops want to knock me. Miss Julie wants to box me in, but somehow I beat those charges like Rocky. The city ethics officer has a JD law degree. Surely she knows that a request to ban citizens from their right to speech at appropriate channels such as City Hall is unconstitutional. I have I'll have our friends at the Heritage Foundation send her a free copy of the Constitution. For the record, I returned a favor of cops showing at my house by sending her handwritten illegal and unconstitutional request to the governor's office, who told us in his inauguration speech that if he will remove all public servants from office who are not protecting the community. I also gave a copy to the Florida Bar, the State Ethics Board, and the state attorney. Do you hear me now? Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Benjamin, H to the O-V. You spell it with a W, but you pronounce it Horbo-V. Moving forward, I love the new City Ethics Board member. Ernest goes to City Hall. Buddy, in this town of 5 people playing hacky sack with $5,000, I wish you the best. You have my support. All of you do. I'm here to help get the snakes out of the grass and grow Florida the way it should be, as a lighthouse of truth and an example of how to live freedom to its fullest. I like the mayor. The town likes the mayor. We see he has a good heart and willing to help Tallahassee. I saw him the day after the retreat at Whataburger with my church's elders. Before I go, real quick, this next part is very important. I hope you are still listening because I don't see any of you taking notes as you should. She could do the community a favor and allow us to trust the city again by resigning. I pray the new ethics board member's first public move is in the direction to make Tallahassee great again and keep the city honest. After the last mayor did a wonderful job of dividing our community and almost bringing socialism to our great state, he was the worst mayor in Florida's history. Folks, I say this to you today, that the next year, 2020, the commies are coming, and I'll leave you with this. We were born free, we will stay free, and America will never be a socialist nation.
Thank you, Mr. Herbovi. On item 155, anyone object to closing that item? Item 156, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On number 156, there was an individual that claimed the Independent Ethics Board was given false information regarding a staff position, and I provided copies of this correspondence to board members, and I recommend closure of this matter.
You don't object to closure? Seeing none, item 157, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Okay, the next one is that I was copied on correspondence sent to others in the community regarding CRA activities and projects. I reviewed the correspondence. I spoke with the complainant and determined that the board had previously determined that similar issues were not within the purview of the Independent Ethics Board, and I recommend closure of that.
Anyone object to closure? And you will remember that at the last meeting, I suggested that we have our attorney look specifically at the issue of the CRA and similar groups to determine how our jurisdiction, particularly in our recommendations, where we would have much broader jurisdiction, how it might be implicated so that we have the ability to consider issues that the board members think we should be able to consider as we move forward with our recommendations. Item 158, I am handling. This alleged that that there were board applications that were not on the list of 21. I've reviewed those. There were applications submitted, but as we just saw with the resignation of one of our, what we thought was a board member, the city charter requires that you must be a City of Tallahassee elector. So anyone who did not meet the legal requirements spelled out in the city charter and applied, we did not put on the list for consideration, since if they did serve on the board, those would be void appointments and could impact decisions that we've made, like we saw happened last month. It also has, excuse me, the complaint also talks about not being allowed to attend public meetings. I have checked, and as far as I know, no one has been banned with one exception who's I think resolved his issues. from attending any of our board meetings, and if anyone ever does find that they are banned, if they will contact me personally, I will make sure that we resolve that before or during a board meeting. And the third part of this complaint is that a member of the board does not reside within the city limits. The member referred to is one of the people at this dais, and we have, behind your backs, we have checked all of your voter records and Save Our Homes, property tax exemptions, and everybody here is good to go. So is there any objection to closing that complaint? Seeing none, it is closed. That moves us on to... I apologize. There's a complaint that's not on the list? Is this the... I understand that you are in mediation? I am, sir. Yes, please, you're recognized.
That was 156.
Oh.
I was trying to be...
I am told it was item 156, but this is probably a far more generic description than...
My complaint as relevant to this board, 156. Right, I didn't, and this summary is not correct, Your Honor. What I allege, Mr. Chairman, is someone filed a complaint I wasn't the initial one of the complaint, but I took it on because the information that was that the city responded to the complainant. Let me just say this because I'm getting nervous and I'm having some medical issues here. I'm not normally confused when I come up here. So let me just hit the reset button. I apologize.
Take a breath.
This board raised the issue of not having a deputy city manager when the reorg came out, and the justification for that was given to this board for not having a deputy city manager was one of the things that I remember was for cost savings, and that they could handle it without. Well, I did file a formal complaint against the city of Tallahassee because I am one of an opinion that the city of Tallahassee has been guilty of what I call, or in my perception, of white privilege. That is, taking white individuals with very least experience and giving them very top jobs with high salaries. In my complaint, I noted that the African-American female who hired the city manager, who has double the experience and managerial and academia of the now city manager, I felt was slighted. And then after I filed my complaint on the 7th, then he turned right back around where he had sent a notice to all of the city employees telling them the same thing he told you. Then, like 2 weeks later, he came back and announced that she was the deputy city manager. And so my grandmother told me, Ms. Graham, that a moving target is hard to hit. And if you have supplied an answer to this board, this executive board, and then you in less than 30 days have made such what I feel is a drastic change, because he just made a decision, he reversed the decision that then took another $200,000 out of my pocket. And I believe that we need to know. And I believe that this board, especially in the time that we're in right now, needs to be a prominent figure as things are going on now. If you notice from these public community meetings, people want answers. I'm so glad our new member was there last night. Transparency, accountability is no longer a public speech. It should be a way of life here at the city of Tallahassee. And Chairman, I pray that you would follow up on this complaint, because I'm not, a justification is in order. I'm not saying you need to lead a big flying investigation, but if I told my mama that I wasn't going to spend $200,000 and then turn around and spent them, somebody need to explain that. That's just too much of a reverse of the ticket without any kind of justification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sims. Are there any members that want to pursue this particular issue? I mean, it is, we have asked the city on numerous occasions to present when they've made management decisions concerning the management of the city, but we have not ever done an investigation of any of those.
Did Mr. Goad respond to the complaint at all?
Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I think you've had more outside conversations than I have.
Well, I think what this complaint relates to, and we typically don't discuss them in detail, but there was a management decision initially to not have a deputy city manager, and subsequently that decision was revisited as a managerial discretion type of decision. And in fact, I believe one of the board members here, Dr. Grant, actually questioned not having a deputy city manager and who would be in charge if there was some kind of situation where the city manager could not act. So in point of fact, we had one board member that said that he questioned that managerial decision. Now, I think board council at the time determined that this was not within the board's jurisdiction to question the managerial decisions of the city in terms of how it's going to allocate staff, especially in leadership positions. And so Mr. Goad did come to this board and talk when he first became city manager. He subsequently made a decision that he wanted to have a deputy city manager.
And how did this occur contemporaneous or in relation to the timing of the election? Did this all happen before the elections, or was it during the election period?
I don't know the precise time. I think it was after the election, and we had a new mayor.
Let's do this, Ms. Sims. I'm going to ask Mr. Reed if he would look at this board's jurisdiction as it relates to managerial decisions of the city. I hesitate to put this board in the posture of.
And that's not what the complaint was about. You're on the wrong road. My issue today is someone from Tallahassee filed a complaint. It wasn't you, it was a citizen who wanted an explanation of why we did not have a deputy city manager.
Right. So they complained that we didn't.
I thought that it was, well, let me say it this way. I think that if a citizen has addressed this board and we have provided them an answer as the board and told them, and when a board member even questioned, what about our status? Because that citizen raised some very managerial questions that this board has jurisdiction over. No, you don't tell him who to pick and when to pick. But if someone asks us a question of how are we going to function without this critical position, and the city manager says this is how we're going to do it, but then he does something different, then I think it is only fair for that city manager to say either we recognize that we do need this position and we are going to bring it back. Thank you very much for your concern, but to just leave that person out there
Okay, Mr. Sims, I got you. What I'm going to do then is withdraw the question for Mr. Reed and ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to just lay out for us for the next meeting a quick timeline of when that decision was made and the justification for the reversal of the decision. It sounds like we are today where everybody wanted us to be, so it's hard from my perspective to figure out why we're complaining about being where we want to be. Okay, I got you, Mr. Sims. Next item on the agenda is the continuation of the Ethics Officer report. This is the monthly budget. You will see that we track ourselves on a year-to-date basis, and then the current month. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, is there anything on here that is unusual that you need to bring to the attention of the board?
I don't believe so this month.
Okay, you will periodically see some large expenditures, but those often have to do with personnel costs or other things. We budget basically within the way the city budgets. So if there are 3 pay periods in a month, you'll see a bump or those kinds of things. Or if we work our board attorney to death, you will see an increase in that line.
Can I say something to that?
Yes, please.
I would just like to say I think we might need to start thinking about an outside audit. We have
That would be great, yes. And
In our recommendations?
yeah, so we have a recommendation on that. I think we're in our
fourth year.
4th or 5th year.
We've already had 4 years.
We've already
We've
had
finished 4
4
years.
years. We're going on
so
5.
sometime maybe toward the end of that we explore, maybe by the end of the year, having a full-blown audit. 5 years, or do you want to do it quicker than that?
I would say
5.
5.
Okay, so we will have some in the next few months. We'll talk about, and I think we could.
That's in our recommendations when we get to that part of the agenda.
Okay.
I think it's actually in a document.
Okay, great.
And Mr. Malachewski can help us understand that,
Right.
too.
The next item in the Ethics Officer report is 2 items. There is a long list of all the public records requests that the city has received. That's 7 or 8 pages long, and then there is a short list of items, 1 page, numbered 107 to 113, that are the ones that they highlighted as more potentially policy-oriented rather than somebody wanting the electric bill for the last few months of a house they're going to buy or something. We started including this some time ago as an opportunity for the members to see what is important to people in the community and for the board members to be able to possibly identify items that they would like to follow up on, whether it's self-initiation of a complaint or just we'd like to get more information. We saw several, for instance, during some of the prior investigations and during the election cycle where we asked for more information. So are there any of these that have jumped out to anybody? Seeing none, the ethics moment this time is going to be lengthy because we are going to go into the background of the board. Since we have some new members, I want to make sure that everybody understands where we are, how we got here. And what I would like to do is recognize Mr. Wilcox. We have a group of advocates who were, I'm going to say responsible for, along with a goodly number of the voters, getting the city charter amended to create the board. So, Mr. Wilcox, in the spirit of providing a history and telling us who you guys are, because these are people you will see at pretty much every one of our meetings, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the board. And I guess we kind of are to blame for why you have to come down here and spend several hours once a month to talk about ethics in Tallahassee. And since we do have a number of new board members, I want to welcome you to the board and thank you for being willing to serve. I thought it might be helpful to give a little background or a little history about how the board came about, as well as what's been going on here with Tallahassee city government. In 2014, we formed a coalition that included my organization, Integrity Florida, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause Florida, and the State Tea Party Network. It was called Citizens for Ethics Reform. The coalition came about because the city had appointed a group of citizens to an ethics advisory task force. The task force met for 6 months and studied the city's ethics policies and then made recommendations for improving ethics in city government. The key recommendation involved the creation of an independent ethics officer who would help provide ethics training for city officials and staff, and also have oversight over those officials and be able to investigate allegations of abuse. The city voted to hire an ethics officer, but they did not give the position the independence that is critical if that ethics officer is to be effective. Under the city's plan, the ethics officer was hired by and reported to the city auditor and the city attorney. Needless to say, a lot of people in the community saw the city's plan for what it was, an empty promise. Citizens for Ethics Reform collected over 20,000 petitions to put a charter amendment before city voters on the 2014 ballot. The amendment does several things. First, it created a volunteer ethics board consisting of one member each appointed by the president of FSU, the president of FAMU, the state attorney, the public, originally it was the chief judge, but it is since at the, initiation of the board and the voters of Tallahassee has been changed to the public defender and the city commission. Those 5 members of the ethics board then select 2 more members. That the ethics board is responsible for hiring and directing the ethics officer. The ethics officer answers only to the ethics board and the citizens of Tallahassee. The second part of the amendment dealt with the financing of city campaigns. The amendment lowered the contribution limit in city races from $1,000 to $250. And finally, the amendment created a limited form of public campaign financing designed to encourage more small donors to participate in city campaigns. It set up a refund program where a citizen of Tallahassee can contribute up to $25 to a city candidate and then have that $25 refunded by the city. The idea is to have an alternative to the typical funders of city campaigns, which are primarily lobbyists, developers, contractors, and others who have business with the city. So what did the city do when we collected the 20,000 petitions signed by the citizens of Tallahassee? Well, they took us to court. They tried to keep the issue off the ballot. The judge ruled in our favor, and our attorney at the time was Sandy Dallenberg. You talk about the board hiring a good attorney. But the mayors and members of the city commission falsely accused us of calling them corrupt. There were others who did talk about corruption in city government, but they were never part of our core group. Our goal was to get ahead of potential corruption, as we had seen in other parts of the state, in places like Palm Beach County, Miami-Dade, and Duval County. All of those counties adopted independent ethics boards after public officials went to jail for corruption. City voters in Tallahassee adopted our anti-corruption charter amendment by 67% of the vote. Our independent ethics board began operation in January 2015. I apologize to board member McNeil and Chair Herring if this is old information for you, because you've been there pretty much from the beginning. But later that year, the board decided to continue with the ethics officer that the city had hired before the charter amendment passed. We disagreed with that decision and argued the board should go through a new hiring process, but Julie Meadows Keefe remains the ethics officer. The ethics board meets monthly and has investigated a number of complaints that have been filed by citizens. The board has been hamstrung by the fact that the city's ethics code is extraordinarily weak. I think everyone in our group was surprised when in the summer of 2017 we learned that the FBI had dropped subpoenas on city government. It had been conducting an undercover investigation for 2 years. In December of last year, City Commissioner Scott Maddox and his longtime business associate were indicted on 44 counts of racketeering and fraud. These are serious criminal corruption allegations. A story about corruption in Tallahassee ran on the front page of the USA Today newspapers all over the country. You know how damaging this was to our city's reputation? The The impact on job creation. No business wants to come to a city where there is pay-to-play corruption. Consider it a corruption tax that we are now all paying. This was exactly what our ethics coalition was trying to prevent with the creation of this board. There have also been complaints filed with our local ethics board and with the Florida Commission on Ethics regarding former city manager Rick Fernandez. He was accused of getting a discount on catering for his daughter's wedding from the city-subsidized Edison restaurant managed by local lobbyist Adam Corey, and of soliciting skybox football tickets from that very same lobbyist. Mr. Fernandez denied both allegations until the Tallahassee Democrat found text messages from Fernandez to Corey asking for the tickets. Fernandez resigned from his position as city manager. The Florida Commission on Ethics recently found probable cause that he had committed 20 civil violations of state ethics law. He has agreed to pay a $6,000 fine. And then there was our former mayor and gubernatorial candidate who also got caught up in the FBI investigation, as well as an investigation by the State Commission on Ethics. Mayor Gillum was also friends with the lobbyist Adam Corey, and Corey arranged some trips and outings for the mayor and his family that the mayor apparently didn't pay for. While he hasn't been criminally indicted, the Commission on Ethics found probable cause that he committed 5 civil violations of ethics laws. Mayor Gillum says he will fight the allegations in court, but the damage to his political career has been done. His former friend Adam Corey released damaging emails and text messages in the final weeks of the gubernatorial campaign, which probably cost Andrew Gillum the election. We don't know if the FBI investigation is complete at this point or whether there will be more indictments. I think what all this has shown us is that there was a culture in city government that officials believed they were entitled to these perks, gifts, and benefits just because they were in a position of power and a lobbyist wanted to build a relationship with them. And that's what this board needs to guard against. You and the ethics officer need to change that culture. Think about it. We were paying Rick Fernandez a salary of $20,000 a month, $240,000 a year. You'd think he could afford his own football tickets, rather than asking a lobbyist for free tickets so he could schmooze with him in his skybox. True public servants instinctively understand that nothing is for free and something is always expected in return. The difference between criminal corruption and civil corruption is quid pro quo, a direct offer of this for that. But often there isn't a direct offer. It's just building a relationship so that when you do need something from the public official, you're probably going to get it. The good news is that the culture at City Hall is changing for the better. We have a new mayor and 4 new city commissioners. Our group met with all of the 2018 candidates for mayor and city commission, and all of them told us that ethics was a top priority. As the ethics board, you are in the process of drafting what we hope will be the gold standard for a municipal ethics code, one that provides clear guidelines for elected officials and employees on how to behave and how to be true public servants. We're hopeful that when the board presents this new ethics code to the commission, it will be adopted. But just a couple of weeks ago, a story appeared in the Tallahassee Democrat talking about an email a city employee sent to nonprofit organizations that receive city funding, asking them to provide free tickets to their fundraising events. So, quote, commissioners and city leadership can stay connected and ensure continued funding. At least one of the nonprofits said it felt like a threat. To his credit, City Manager Reese Goad immediately said the email was out of step with the position of city leaders. Mayor John Daly said, quote, the city of Tallahassee is not soliciting free tickets to any event, period. Like I said, it's all about creating an ethical culture that will protect the city's reputation. no, I'm sorry. Like I said, it's all about creating an ethical culture for the entire city government. Your mission is to help with this effort. It's not to protect the city's reputation or to cover up embarrassing incidents like the ticket email. It's to protect the public. So hope that was helpful. And
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Any questions of Mr. Wilcox? Ms. Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. I don't have a question, but I've been making notes. Yes, I have been. So I've sort of outlined what I think we, the board, are tasked with doing as we move forward. And I would just like to run through these and see if we're all in agreement. One, we've got to resolve the issue of our board attorney, which is critically important. As we move forward, we need good legal counsel. Two, we are now tasked with appointing not just one new board member that is our decision, but we now need the public defender to also provide a recommendation. Three, I think we need clarification of our jurisdiction. I keep hearing this come up. What do we, in fact, have jurisdiction to consider? Four, and I think this is most important, we need to rewrite our ethics code, give it some teeth, and then have the City Commission hopefully support the recommendation. Is there anything that I'm missing?
I would agree with Board Member Graham. I would agree with all those points.
Okay.
And you have our commitment to when you do go before the City Commission and try to persuade them to adopt your proposed ordinance, our group will be supportive and help you with that.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you, and I appreciate you, Mr. Sims. I appreciate the citizen engagement. It's very important. And the reason I sit on this board is because I believe ethics and integrity is the most important component of what we bring to public service. Ethics and integrity. So I just wanted to clarify as I'm making my notes. And if you ever feel like I've missed something, please let me know, because I think that's our task as a board right now, in that order, to get these things done. And I think once we get these things done, we can all move forward together.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Wilcox? Seeing none, I'm going to segue off his comments. Just to put a couple things in perspective, this independent ethics board is directly dependent on the City Commission in three significant ways. First, we rely on them for our budget. They have provided us, and we'll hear more about that, but they have provided our budget from the beginning. We have had examples. One of our board members was on a board in another state where their budget got cut to pretty much zero, as I recall. And we have not faced those kinds of challenges. Second is the City Commission by ordinance sets the sanctions that this board is allowed to levy. Now, it's part of the ethics code, but the sanctions provision is separate, and we have heard about that a number of times from one person in particular in the audience. And third, the board creates, again by ordinance, the jurisdiction of the board, which is what the recommendations that we'll be talking about after the break particularly focus on. So in the first 3 years of this board's existence, the city ethics ordinance addressed only the following things: enhanced financial disclosure for elected city officials, disclosure requirements for lobbyists who represent the city, not lobbyists who appear before the city, but lobbyists who represent the city, disclosure of offers of employment to elected city officials, voting abstention, and required ethics training. That was our complete jurisdiction for nearly the first 3 years we were in existence. But the charter, as the amendment was written, does require this board to assist the City Commission in the development of the ethics code and to make recommendations in all areas of ethics and corruption. And in fact, actually the charter goes on to say the City Commission shall consider the proposals we make that are filed with them. That was an issue, I would say, that we had. So in our first few years, we made a number of generic recommendations in non-ordinance city policy, including we thought the city ought to track outside employment, the city ought to have more strict gift policies, anti-fraternization policies, and clarifications on lobbyist registration requirements. And in each case, the city did make some policy change in those areas. Those did not affect the jurisdiction of the board, however. Then in early 2017, we submitted formal recommendations and I think a month later, draft ordinances specifically to expand our jurisdiction in the areas of misuse of position, acceptance or solicitation of gifts, the accessibility of Form 1 financial disclosures, which would be the non-elected officials, the management-type financial disclosures, use of city resources for campaign purposes, clarification of the board's authority relating to city vendors who are performing outsourced services, and failure to register as a lobbyist who is lobbying the city. Basically, the City Commission adopted versions of our proposals on misuse and gifts. However, in those areas, particularly misuse is a great example. We had looked at the State Commission on Ethics and found that the number one category of complaints broadly that they see on an annual basis year after year falls into the category of misuse of position, which is why that was our number one request, because we thought that captures a lot of bad behavior. They made two changes to our request. First, they applied it to only 9 people, the elected and appointed city officials, the 5 elected and 4 appointed city officials. And second, while we had recommended, as does Chapter 838 on the criminal corrupt misuse of position, we had recommended knowingly and intentionally as the burden, they added the word corrupt or corruptly, which happens to be in the ethics code. It's interesting that the civil standard of proof is higher than the criminal standard of proof in Florida law. But they made both of those things were added to our draft, and again left us with this jurisdiction that is very narrow, basically misuse of position by 5 people with a standard that is very difficult to prove, and some gift restrictions that, as was pointed out by Dr. Jackson, are subject to measuring the value of the gift and the ways that people may choose to measure the value of gifts. So that's why you will find the new members will find that they have been dropped into a discussion of jurisdiction of the board. We are following up. Those changes were made by the city in mid to late 2017. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, was it?
Yeah, I have a comprehensive
you're
history
go
that
over
I
that.
can go through. Yeah.
But we are now attempting to take the next step. We've seen that most of the complaints that we receive don't fall within our jurisdiction, or even some of the things that members have raised that they think are ethics problems, again, don't fall technically within our jurisdiction. So that's the reason for the push. So I apologize to, we started this last August or so, and so we are asking people a little bit to drink from the fire hose.
In my personal opinion, this is good, because we're going to have a fresh start.
Absolutely.
And we're all going to be working together to make sure that we're holding everyone to the highest ethical standards and standards of integrity that we all should hold ourselves to. So in terms of developing and I think Mr. Wilcox, you referred to this, in terms of developing the new ethics code, we have verbal agreement from the City of Commission that they are supportive. They don't know what the language is yet. We have not provided them that kind of key component. Okay. But that's what we're working on.
And I think Ms.
And I'm new to this board, but I'm looking forward to doing the work of putting that together.
And Ms. Meadows-Keefe, we segue to you now on some of the history.
Well, I'm just going to refer to the agenda real quick just to make sure we've covered the stuff
Okay, I don't have
in
that
order.
version of the agenda.
Okay.
Sorry, I do have that version of the agenda.
We covered, I'm just going to go back through real quick, and obviously, Mr. Chair, you interrupt me or board members at any point, but we did go over 6A, which is the charter amendment. We had Mr. Wilcox present on that. And then B was commission support. The chair did go through that. The one point I do want to point out is the chair said that we are funded, the board is funded by the City Commission. That is pursuant to the charter amendment, that the charter amendment requires that. So that was something we were given, we didn't ask for.
So we would go then to Ms. McNeil.
Yes, on
who's
the
gonna talk
budget
to us about budget.
and audit
And to
process.
the extent you want to segue into the audit stuff some more, please, you're recognized.
Explain the process for the RFP for us getting a budget?
Recognize the city auditor.
Good afternoon. So at a prior meeting, you all had asked about audit coverage for your board, and that calls to mind to me the question, what kind of audit coverage you're seeking. We have an external audit firm that prepares or audits the financial statements of the city, and since you get your funding through the city of Tallahassee, the expenditures made by the board are subject to audit procedures by our external audit firm. Now, that doesn't guarantee they will be selected and tested, but they are part of the bucket of transactions that would be considered during their audit testing. If you sought more specific audit coverage, which was my perception was what you were doing, we have an opportunity with our request for proposal to include language in it that will allow the ethics board to seek services from our selected external auditor to specifically test transactions related to the ethics board. So that covers the ability to request and have a schedule of costs for seeking those kind of audit coverage for financial matters. I think it's relevant that we've added to our audit work plan for the Office of City Auditor an audit which is more operational or programmatic in nature of the City of Tallahassee's ethics. That type of audit of soft controls of culture and ethical tone is required periodically by any audit organization that follows professional auditing standards from the Institute of Internal Auditors. There was an audit of that nature performed back in 2009 by my predecessor, Sam McCall, and since then, I think has been well pointed out, the whole structure related to ethics within our organization and enterprise more largely has changed dramatically. So it's time for another look. So we would be interested to hear your thoughts and guidance and input into that project when we undertake it this year. In 2009, that included surveys of city employees to understand whether or not they were aware of city policies that relate to ethical conduct. And we would intend on repeating that type of survey process to kind of, I don't know if you could say it's a trend, but to see where we stand today with regard to those type of things as well, as looking at what processes and practices are in place. So I think given all that, there's ample opportunity for both financial and operational audit coverage related to ethics.
Is that something I can get a copy of, the 2009 report that was done?
Absolutely. I'll provide it to
get that.
Julie.
I've got it.
Okay.
Ms. McNeil, how about if we ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to put on a future agenda this issue and let the board members have a chance to think about the programmatic side of the audit.
Which route we want to go.
And then also ask the city auditor if would it be the sense of the board that we do want him to get a cost from his independent auditor so that we could buy our own little mini audit, financial audit?
Yeah, I've generally found that that's the best path to take. I've been involved in other audits of other entities, and an outside audit is generally recommended. I mean, I'm not saying, we obviously have to control the cost of such said audit, but
Well, but if that's
no disrespect to you as the city auditor.
None taking. So we are in the process of putting together the RFP, which we expect to have an independent audit firm on board by midsummer. And the process of going through that and selecting the firm will dictate the costs that would be available for any services from our external auditor, whether they're requested by this board or some other city entity.
Okay, but as long as within that contract, because I'm assuming you guys will wisely consider things that we are not aware of, we'll be able to do a little sub purchase.
Yes, we've actually specified that in the request for proposal, so all firms that compete for the audit business will have knowledge that that type of request may be forthcoming and is part and parcel of what they're bidding for.
Ms. McNeil, you happy?
Yes, I recommend proceeding with that.
Okay,
process.
okay, outstanding. We will do that. We will put the issue of the programmatic side audit we'll have on our agenda, and we'll get back with you with some board recommendations.
Have you defined the scope of that audit?
We have not yet defined the scope of that audit, but I think in reviewing the work that Sam McCall did in the audit report, you would get a sense certainly of what we would anticipate the scope of that being.
So we could have a discussion at a meeting about the scope of your audit?
Certainly.
Okay.
Okay, Ms. McNeil, was that it for you?
Yes, that's good for me.
Okay, Mr. Smith, I think you were going to talk about the penalties provision, the ordinance that the city has authorized.
Yes. Good evening. I would like to recommend that we move with the penalties as written.
You want to give, for the new members in particular, you want to give them just a couple of the highlights of what kinds of things the city has authorized as penalties should we find an ethics violation?
Okay. If we look at 214A, well, let me go down first. I think it's important to start off, for those of you all who may be new or not as familiar with this section, you do not have to have a sworn complaint to report a matter to the Ethics Board or through the fraud hotline. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay. We may issue oral or written reprimands, letters of instruction, corrective actions, referral to appropriate agencies, typically some of those that may have jurisdiction that we may not have, and also additional ethics training at the violator's expense, community service, and fines for late filings of financial disclosures. Should any civil penalties be collected, that goes into the City of Tallahassee's general fund, and the board may also order payments of investigative costs, again, not to exceed $1,000. So those are some of the highlights of the penalties that we're authorized to render.
Okay. And we have received some testimony in the past, primarily from Dr. Jackson, that he would like to see far more substantial penalties. We haven't really run into this yet because we haven't had an ethics complaint where we got as far as a penalty stage. So that is something, as we proceed with recommendations, that probably all the members ought to think about. If there are things there that they think particularly need to be changed, I would raise them at probably our next meeting, and we will consider those.
I do have one.
Yes, excuse me.
On number 4, A4, corrective action, I think we probably need to discuss what would be the limits on those and how would that be defined.
Okay. Limits and definitions on corrective actions.
Just to give an example, you mentioned that I was a member of another ethics board and another. We could actually terminate members. So would that be a corrective action? So, that's something that we may need to consider.
Okay. Particularly if our jurisdiction expanded beyond 9 people.
Correct.
Okay. So that's one that goes on the list tonight. Anybody who has anything in the future, obviously get with Ms. Meadows-Keefe or bring it to the next meeting. Next, I'm going to recognize Mr. Reed as it relates to jurisdictional issues and also as it relates to the quasi-judicial nature of the board. One of the things that we struggled with in the beginning was that we need to sometimes sit on our hands and limit our comments to avoid inadvertently recusing ourselves if we have a discussion during a meeting that subsequently turns into an ethics investigation, an ethics complaint. that we may have ruled ourselves out as neutral fact finders or decision makers. So, Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as the jurisdiction that we're awarded, I know that at the last meeting we discussed that is, I think, a primary goal of this board is that is something that needs to be addressed in our new code so we could expand that. Currently, I think the chairman, you've previously stated there's the 9 individuals in which we have the personal jurisdiction over, your 5 elected city commissioners, your 4 appointed charter officers. As far as your employees, which I think was just mentioned, we currently do not have any jurisdiction over those employees, and that is something that we could consider and explore when we begin our drafts to the revised ethics code. There are also specific infractions, violations included in the ordinance, in which is our subject matter jurisdiction, in which we are limited to. There are many complaints, and many people could have very legitimate issues that they are concerned with, but if we lack the jurisdiction, our hands are somewhat tied. We can't go any further, and that is something that we'll want to address. And if we see maybe a trend of issues being brought to the board that have required us to tie our hands behind our back, maybe that's a consideration we make later on determining whether to expand our jurisdiction, which it sounds like it's been made, but how far do we expand that? As far as the quasi-judicial function of this board, I think I worked with 3 of the 5 here previously on the last time a complaint was brought before this board that reached beyond the legal sufficiency stage, and I wanted to go ahead and review some of that. First is the first stage. You have your complaint that can be brought by the public, or it can be self-initiated by this board. Once that you get to that point, typically, I think it's staff, it doesn't designate who, but I think previously it's been the ethics officers that will review it for legal sufficiency. And the way that determination is made is you are to read the complaint, only stay within the 4 corners of that complaint, and read it as if all allegations were true, would a violation have occurred, and would the board have jurisdiction over the individual accused of making the violation. Once reading it as true with a presumption of truth is met, then you pass the legal sufficiency stage, and then it goes to what is our second stage, and that is our probable cause panel. As we did in the fall where I was serving as the advocate is retained and does an initial preliminary investigation to determine whether there is probable cause in order to move to stage 3. I think when I've done that in the past, I worked closely with the ethics officer to gather all the information that was available at the time. To get to the probable cause, if you recall at the time, we presented the issue to the board. The board essentially serves as the probable cause panel, and you are held to a standard of proof known as the substantial evidence standard, and essentially that is when sufficient evidence that would lead a reasonable person to believe a violation occurred. And that is a standard similar to preponderance of the evidence that's unique in administrative law. Once the board has made that determination, let me go back also. At this point, the complaint is confidential. There are ways that the confidentiality could be lifted. If it's dismissed as being legally insufficient, the complaint becomes public at that point. If the respondent or subject, however we decide to define that person, if they choose to waive that confidentiality, it can be made public. If the board determines that it will not investigate further, it's made public. And if it finds probable cause and it's moving on to stage 3, it's made public. So those are the 4 reasons when a complaint will be its confidentiality will be lifted. So we are still in stage 2. Substantial evidence is applied to determine whether probable cause exists. If the board finds that there is no probable cause, at that point, the complaint will be dismissed, and as previously stated, it will then be made available to the public. If the board determines that there is probable cause, again, it will also be made available to the public, and the confidentiality will be lifted, and that person will then be entitled to a hearing. The way our rules are written, they will have 14 business days in order to request a hearing. And if they fail to do so within 14 business days, the exact language is that it's deemed waived. This language is softer if anybody's dealt with 120 administrative law cases, which is you have 21 calendar days on day 22, you're out of luck. This is a little softer where you could possibly argue excusable neglect if somebody were late. And of course, the board could also intervene and request a hearing if it feels that that is appropriate. But that is, so that is how the hearing is initiated. At that point, the case will then be referred to the Division of Administrative Hearings. And I think we do have a contract with DOA to conduct our hearings. This is where, I think this was one of the issues that was discussed way before I was on board, is where is board counsel and the advocate, where do they lie? And board counsel needs to, at all times, the board is the counsel's client. An advocate has somewhat of a different role, which is why there needs to be two different positions and there need to be two very different roles. That issue then goes to DOA. There is a standard of proof at DOA is clear and convincing evidence when dealing with public officials. There is a case, brought it up here. It's out of the 1st District Court of Appeal, which is the big courthouse in Southwood, so that is the binding precedence on this jurisdiction. It's Latham v. Florida Commission on Ethics, and if anybody would like the cite, it is 694 Southern 2nd 83, and this is the case where the 1st District Court of Appeal essentially lays out on ethics cases. Here they reversed a decision by the State Commission on Ethics because they proved by preponderance of the evidence that a public official had violated the state ethics code. The court reversed and said that because you are taking an action that could publicly damage the professional reputation of an individual like a public official, they have to be held to a higher standard. And so that, determining that standard is really out of our hands. It's under the 1st District Court of Appeal, there's a clear and convincing evidence standard. Public official is, in my opinion, would apply to all of the 9 people that we have now, even though 5 of those 9 are elected. If you refer to Section 112.313, Paragraph 1 of Florida statute, it does define public official, in which it does distinguish the fact that it can include elected and appointed officials. The appointed official needs to be pretty high up, and I think that the 4 appointed individuals that are subject to our jurisdiction would fit that definition, so I would argue that clear and convincing would apply to them as well. And I don't have the case from the 1st DC. I have a 4th DC case to reference on this. But if we were to expand our jurisdiction to cover some employees or all employees, then we move into a different area where you're dealing with a career service employee. These individuals don't have the professional reputation at risk that a public official would have, which is essentially the court's argument, not mine. And the court has said that they should not be held to the higher clear and convincing standard because for them it is merely more of an employment action like a civil case you would find in an Article III court in which those cases are decided on preponderance of the evidence. So if this board were determined to expand its jurisdiction to cover employees, whatever level employees that might be, we would also want to discuss our standard of proof, and I think based on the case law, it would more than likely have to be the preponderance of the evidence standard over at DOA. I think that was essentially my presentation.
Any questions, Mr. Reed? That when it goes to DOA, am I correct that it comes back to us with recommended findings of fact and conclusions of law, and we're pretty much bound by the findings of fact, but we could disagree with the DOA hearing officer's conclusions of law?
Yes, with the administrative law judge at DOA will create a recommended order. That comes back to the agency, and that's how it works in 120 proceedings as well. The agency is, the facts are supposed to be presumed as true, the argument being that the judge who hears the testimony, sees the evidence, has a better idea on what the facts really are than a board that's not seeing that in real time. Unless there's an egregious error, sometimes you could set aside some facts, but generally the facts are accepted as true. You can have recourse on conclusions of law as that are stated in the recommended order.
Okay, so if we have one of these that goes then, we would then issue it, presumably taking what the ALJ had said, And then if there was an appeal, it would go to the DCA.
Yes.
Okay, so we are in fact sitting kind of quasi-judicially like a trial court. So again, that's been one of our concerns over the last couple of years about making sure that we don't express any bias in interactions with people testifying. So after Mr. Reed, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, we're going to have you talk briefly about our bylaws, because that's where we go after the ordinance, where if it's not required to be in the ordinance, then it goes in our bylaws. And we spent, Ms. McNeil, the first year and a half working on bylaws, one of the more painful processes, because we didn't feel like we were accomplishing anything, but it was all stuff we had to have. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will echo those comments related to the bylaws. In fact, I think one of the reporters from the newspaper described it as plodding, P-L-O-D-D-I-N-G. But a priority for the board was establishing a sound framework for a process to lay down how the board would operate. So the board was very deliberate at this time to come up with things that they felt were important, and generally the board has adhered to these bylaws as initially written. A strength of the board is that at times when we find the bylaws need to be changed to accommodate something or something hasn't worked, we have gone ahead and amended or altered the bylaws. So we have things that define the role of the ethics officer, how members are appointed, how meetings are conducted, how votes are taken, how complaints are initiated and handled. And there actually is a need to do some revisions on the bylaws at this point to reflect that we are now sending our matters to DOA. At the time, there was kind of an open question whether we were going to use DOA or if the board was going to actually serve as the finder of facts in these matters. We did actually set out a diagram of our complaint process and where different complaints go based upon the subject matter. So, and then we have a process for amending, waiving, or suspending board bylaws. So that is in capsule form what we've got as bylaws. So if anyone has specific questions regarding those, that is going to be part of our work plan and recommendations to go through those bylaws and clean them up. But probably the best course of action is to see where the commission heads on our recommendations and then go ahead and conform our bylaws to whatever the commission does. And the board counsel we had for a few months, who was Ms. Marstiller, recommended that you not necessarily amend your bylaws piecemeal, which was what the board's tendency was. We'd see a problem, we'd see an issue, and we'd revise the bylaws. The suggestion was that it be more comprehensive and it be like an annual exercise to do, so it's kind of a cohesive process. But the board's been fluid, and since it's been new in developing, as we've seen issues, the board's been quick to try to resolve them. But going forward, we're trying to be a little bit more systematic about how that process occurs. Any questions?
I do have one. I'm looking at Article 3A, how the members are appointed.
Yes.
And I see the big change that was made last year had to go to a referendum.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a question of the board cleaning things up. How is that determined? At what point do we say we are powerless to do this and it needs to go before the voters?
Well, can I answer?
Sure.
Okay. When the board was first initiated, that seat was to be filled by the chief circuit judge. There were some opinions that were located that indicated that circuit judge should not make that appointment. The board did get legal opinion from our board counsel at the time related to how we could fix that and get the 7 members that the framers of this intended to have. And the legal advice we got, and I think was concurred with by the city attorney's office, that if this board were created and established through a charter amendment, that it needed to be fixed through a charter amendment. So if the charter amendment said chief circuit judge, a charter amendment needed to go on the ballot to fix it. So that went before the commission as a recommendation. In our last recommendation letter, the commission went ahead and put it on the ballot. Once it was passed, we conformed our bylaws to match, and hopefully that version you have has B, 1 member selected by the public defender.
Yes. Are there any other bylaws that would apply to as far as needing a charter amendment?
So far, I don't know of any. It would depend on the recommendations that this board makes. If it makes substantive changes or any changes to the language in that initial charter amendment, there'd be a theory at least, and we'd have to consult with board counsel that would again have to come before the voters.
That one was relatively unique in that the bylaw parrots part of the charter, the city charter. So it would only be where, to make a bylaw readable, we pick up language verbatim, pretty much verbatim out of the city charter that we would have to go back to the charter. But that's the only one of those that we have seen so far, and it was not an intent by this board to change, to necessarily want to change the charter. It was just an effort to comply with the will of the voters that originally amended the charter, that we'd have a 7-member board when it was impossible for us to get that 7th member. We actually suggested to the city commission originally that they allow us, the board, to pick that 7th member, and they didn't like that. They looked at the public defender and they said, since the state attorney has an appointment, it seems balanced, parallel, let the public defender have an appointment. And they asked us, and the response unanimously from the board was, great, just get us a 7th member. Okay, and then I think the last thing in our little background piece here, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, is you have a spreadsheet on ethics complaints?
And this, yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. This is just for reference and education of the public that may be reviewing and new board members that since inception, or since I guess I came to the city and took over the ethics and fraud hotline, that was one of the first things I got that's remained consistent since I got here. I track every inquiry I get so that we have a historical document just of the kinds of issues we've gotten. Some are more related to the function of this board as intended than others. Initially, we had complaints about people's neighbors whose grass was too long, and people that were just generally discontented about different things. One parent was concerned that parking citations were issued to her college student. These were all things we couldn't handle. But then there were obviously things that we did handle. Shade or executive session meetings on various complaints. But this is just for history. I think the board's very conscious of documenting its history and its evolution, and so this is just basically that comprehensive document that shows what the public's brought to our attention.
Ms. Graham.
Yes. Have we ever, and clearly we're now moving into a new phase where we will have hopefully a new ethics code in place, but have we ever attempted to summarize for the citizens of the city of Tallahassee, in fact, what this board has jurisdiction over? We have. What steps have we taken in that regard?
Board Member Graham, we did at the last time the board made its recommendations to the City Commission, It was suggested by Board Member Davis, who was the prior state attorney appointee, that we do some publicity in the Democrat. So we've done press releases, news stories, speaking in the community. So we do attempt to educate the public on the board's functions.
You have the handbook.
Pardon? I'm sorry,
We have
Mr. Chair.
we have an
Oh, and we
ethics
do
handbook
have a
to hand
citizen,
out.
that's also true. That part of what we were required to do is create a citizen ethics handbook that I worked closely with another board member to do,
Yes.
and that's handed out to everyone. So the education component's been crucial, and we've tried to accomplish that.
And I do believe that it's understandably confusing about what this board has jurisdiction to handle. And citizens of City of Tallahassee come before us and believe that we have the authority to address their issue. And I think when we write this ethics code, we're going to need to go through that process again of informing the citizens of Tallahassee what this board can handle from a jurisdictional standpoint.
And to add insult to injury,
Oh, please.
if you will, the charter amendment also creates a hotline where people
Yes,
can call in.
I have been in the ethics officer's office while the hotline is going off.
And those handling those hotline calls, which are not ethics complaints, but they relate
Necessarily.
to they may be. If an ethics complaint comes in on the hotline, then it is within the board's jurisdiction. But if that hotline generates a call or a contact that is not related to ethics, it still gets handled, and it is solely within the ethics officer's purview. It does not come before the board, although she will tell us all of these things. So we are trying to do a better job of distinguishing on these between those things that are hotline calls and those things that fall into the area of ethics
And
complaints.
that's in the bylaws. We do have a process going, hearkening back to the bylaws, we do have a section where it says a certain type of call, if it fits into this category, goes over here. And then I do have a tracking mechanism where I don't just let it get dropped into space and a black hole. I will periodically follow up and say what happened in this matter and try to see how it was resolved, not because we had jurisdiction, but just because the follow-up and the closure is important. And there have been times when, although something hasn't been within our jurisdiction, the board has thought it appropriate to write a letter or some kind of guidance document to the city commission and say, hey, this really wasn't technically ours, but this came to our attention, and we would suggest that you do the following. And those have been very well received by the commission and by city leadership. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. I just think as we are moving forward that we're going to need to re-engage with informing the citizenry. How do you say that? Someone help me out.
Citizenry?
Mr. Wilcox of Tallahassee, about the new jurisdiction, the jurisdiction that will be established in the future.
And I love doing that. That's one of my
I know
jobs.
Julie has talked about going to, homeowners associations and those kinds of groups, reaching out beyond the training that's necessary for city officials and volunteer board members and such, but trying to have a broader base of people who have an opportunity to ask questions.
I want to go, and I go wherever
Well, and
I'm
I
invited.
also think we should use other methods as well. I mean, a lot of people get their information today from social media, so I'm not sure how we're using social media to get information out there, but I think we should use this opportunity to re-engage the people of Tallahassee. I changed the word. People's a lot easier to say. Re-engage the people of Tallahassee in what our role is, and hopefully start to quell some of the concerns about integrity and ethics in our city.
Right. And the opportunity here, once the city commission reacts to our recommendations, that's the perfect time for us to really put some effort in.
And I know there's an urgency to this. I recognize that. To get that done, it seems like that's a key component to be able to move forward.
Okay, the rest of our meeting is basically going to be on what we had been calling our blue sky recommendations. And the concept there was, at least I grew up with blue sky lists, meaning anybody can throw any idea and we're not going to censor it, we're not going to audit it. if it's stupid, if it's unconstitutional, if everybody hates it, we're putting it on the list anyway. So we are beyond now blue sky recommendations, because we have over the last few months done some to cut from this list those things that were perceived pretty much uniformly as non-starters. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to that. We're going to take a 15-minute break to let people stretch their legs, and we will come back, and that will be pretty much the rest of the meeting. And Mr. Baines, are we okay to recognize you at that point, or would you like to be recognized now? Okay, we'll recognize you then after the break.
Good. I have to go to the restroom.
It was longer than 15 minutes, which speaks to my inability to tell time. The last significant item on our agenda is to go through what we had been calling our blue sky recommendations. These ultimately will be recommendations, just ethics ordinance recommendations, or some much drier title. Under the charter, again, we are required to make recommendations to the city in all areas of ethics and corruption, and the City Commission is required to consider our recommendations. And then with help, they will consider them favorably. The charter doesn't say favorably, but we have folks to help with that. So this is a list that used to be much broader. It was narrowed some to get rid of some non-starter things. Like one of the things was to save money, we could simply not broadcast our meetings or record our meetings. That would save a small amount of money, and that was universally dismissed as a bad idea. But we put it on the list because it was a legitimate possibility. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, do you want to walk through this? You want me to walk through it? Would you like to proceed on this?
I would propose that I start.
Okay, go. So, board members, as you have questions or concerns about individual things, let's talk about them as we hit those issues. And then if there are issues that aren't on here that have occurred to you, we can raise them at the end.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first part that we're to deal with is just a bit of background on previous documents and process. So the chair had alluded to this, but before approaching the board's draft recommendations for 2019, and I do want to say on the record, just for clarity, these are draft recommendations. There should be draft watermarks on some of this, but these are not final. There was some confusion last year, I think, when we had recommendations. People thought they were final, and these are drafts. But between November 2016 and February 2017, this is a bit of history. The board completed a self-evaluation. The board met for the first time in 2015. So between November 16 and February 2017, the board completed a self-evaluation focusing on changes that would better align board responsibilities with the charter amendment. And then they also prepared a document for the City Commission that contained a series of recommendations. And I did have what I thought was a procedural history of how our first set of recommendations came about. But we first issued our set of recommendations in 2016. I want to say it was March. And it took several months for the commission to actually consider those recommendations. So the letter we initially sent had suggestions for where we wanted the commission to go. There was a gap of several months where the board was going back and forth with the city on actual language to be proposed to the commission. It was at that point that the board directed our board counsel at the time to proceed to draft language to forward to the city commission. After that experience, the board determined that in the future, when it submitted recommendations to the city commission, that it would actually go ahead and provide draft language to expedite the consideration of the recommendations. So we felt like that was a labor-saving method and a way to expedite and speed the process, that there would actually be language in front of the commission. So I believe the final set of recommendations were signed off and passed, and I remember this January 31st, 2017, is when those changes related to misuse of position, gifts, and the other changes that were previously discussed were passed. So the way the blue sky list, as the chair put it, kind of came into being is round about the summer last year, we started compiling that comprehensive list that came from not only stakeholders, citizens, city staff, fellow board members, and best practices that we were able to identify from around the state and the country. And those turned into that blue sky list, and the list grew. And in the last several months, the board started the narrowing process. So for those that are new, the blue sky list was designed to be large, and now we are focusing our attention on what the board's determined to be the most important things that are important to address. So that's the history of how our first set of recommendations came in front of the commission, the lessons learned from that, and how these set of recommendations are being prepared at this point in time. The other thing that we had decided was that we're supposed to make an annual report to the commission, that we make the report and recommendations in the same document so that they can kind of see, especially for the brand new commissioners and the new mayor, where the board's been and where it's going. So it's going to contain, and I think this is in your materials, a brief summary of inception to now, and then bridge into how we got these recommendations. So I think that's the background, Mr. Chair.
And one of the takeaways is that there may be items that the board likes, but that we're not quite sure we're ready to move on yet. So it's not like this is our one bite at the apple. I would hope that the board would do this at least every couple of years. Look at its jurisdiction, look at all of the complaints it has received, all of the articles in the newspaper, all the testimony in the meeting, and decide if that jurisdiction is working in the current environment, and then make recommendations as appropriate. So again, this should not be our only chance to make some recommendations.
I did want to clarify that the board did send its initial draft in March of 2017. We wrote the follow-up letter with our draft language in June of 2017. The commission held an ethics workshop in November of 2017, and at that time we had some additional proposals by some other elected officials, and then on January 31st, 2018, the commission passed the code. So the timeline was from March 2017, it took until January 31st, 2018 for any revisions to occur. So the board this time wants to expedite that process. The board doesn't hopefully want it to take that long. So we're going to present a comprehensive packet for folks so that they can move.
Okay, so looking at, there's a document titled Memorandum and Subject Blue Sky Recommendations dated February 13th. Mm-hmm. If we look at that, this is the list as it has been narrowed. First item on there was subpoenas to give the board authority to subpoena documents or persons necessary in investigation of legitimate ethics complaints. We have our prior attorney suggested that it is something that can be done. It would probably take a charter amendment. That is something that we would have to work on, and any draft language then would not be a draft ordinance, but would be a draft charter amendment if in fact that is the applicable law. So, any comments or questions about subpoena power? This obviously would be something we would use very sparingly.
They would be able to subpoena documents and individuals.
Right. But it would allow us to do a better job before something got to DOA of actually knowing what we're sending over there. On ordinance recommendations, that any lobbyists that advocate before the city commission would have to register and could be fined for failure to register. Most of the lobbying requirements right now fall on people who lobby for the city, not people who lobby the city. So that would be an expansion. We would hope carefully drafted so that an individual person or a volunteer representative of a homeowners association, somebody like that, is not what we would consider to be a lobbyist. It would be more in the nature of what the state considers lobbyists, people who are paid to do a job, people who, through a series of gifts or favors or contributions, have gained access and use that access in order to sell someone else's issue. That's what we're thinking about in terms of lobbyists here. We're not trying to limit individual citizens or concerned citizens' access to government. Along with that, required reporting by city elected and appointed officials, and this might also go down to some management officials, to have to report anything of value that is offered to them in an effort to influence their official behavior. That's reaching out really to gather some behavior by persons who are not city employees. But it would, and we think this is the kind of thing that is really preventative in nature. We would hope there wouldn't ever be any of these reported, because people ought not to be doing it to start with, and particularly once they realize that they're going to get caught, if they even think about it, hopefully they would back off of that thought. In describing this to some students one time, they all said, well, that's bribery. Isn't that already illegal? And we're hoping to capture behavior that's a little broader than typical bribery, but sometimes when somebody gives someone a particularly favorable deal with a wink and a nod, that probably wouldn't pass muster for the criminal elements of bribery. On misuse, we would like to get rid of, or this proposes getting rid of the word corruptly and insert knowingly and intentionally in terms of the public official's behavior. That is the same language that's used in Chapter 838 on criminal misuse of public position. And we think that it ought to apply, or this would propose, I shouldn't say we think, this would propose that it apply to more than the 9 elected and appointed city officials. Yes, sir.
The language here, and you just referred to it, that here and in subsequent items seems to presuppose an expansion of jurisdiction to all employees, but there's no direct address of jurisdiction in any of this. Is that intentional?
Right. What we found was when we started trying to do some drafting, each provision could potentially be a little bit different. There might be provisions that we think ought only to apply to management employees. There might be provisions that we think ought to apply to anyone who is required to file a financial disclosure, which would involve people who award bids or who spend money. There might be some that ought to apply to any supervisory employee. There might be some that ought to apply to any employee. So the idea, I think, would be to on each one of these, as in the drafting, to include on each one of these elements of the ethics ordinance something that is reasonable. For instance, on misuse of position, we might have a discussion whether that really ought to apply to every employee of the city of Tallahassee. If you have a groundskeeper, is that something we're really interested in, or should it be some higher level or narrower group of employees? So that'll be a discussion we'd have case by case. And I think what we would want to do is give the drafter, whoever that may be, some guidance to expand the groups in reasonable, beyond the 9 elected and appointed officials in some reasonable way.
That's what you drafted. And refer them to that. They have that in the materials.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let me go through the memo.
Okay.
Because this follows. There is in your materials. There's I think a 4-page draft, says draft recommendations at the top, that tends to track through these and has the current ordinances with strike through and underlining. That was my attempt to just get something on paper to get started. As you all know, going from a concept to anything on paper is always a great first step, even if what you first get on paper, like my attempt, is not great. At least it's a point to start. Going back to the memo, gifts. Revising the gift ordinance to reflect 0 gifts from entities that are doing business or seeking to do business with the city, including lobbyists. Not any gift. Obviously, we would not want somebody's mother to not be able to give them a Christmas present. Then disclosure or use of city information to have a strict prohibition on anybody who gains insider information as a result of their employment or office with the city that is not available to the public, and using that information either while they're employed or after their employment, while the information is still not available to the public, in an attempt to benefit themselves or a friend or a family member. So if they know that the city's thinking about developing some part of town, but it hadn't really been openly discussed yet, they ought not to be telling their best friend, go buy property in that part of town, go buy land, because it's going to be worth a whole lot more money when the city needs to pay for it. Conflicting employment and contractual relationships. This would track very much what is in the state ethics law that prohibits employment or contract, and there actually is a bill this year to tighten this up in the state law. Conflicting employment or contractual relationships, we know that the state ethics law and our part-time legislature, our part-time city commission, they're expected to have jobs, they're expected to support their families, they need to be able to make a living and engage in private activities the same as any citizen, unless those cause a recurring or continuing conflict with their job. So there are a lot of ways that those conflicts could occur, and this would basically try to be a blanket prohibition on any of those things. That requires some good judgment, and that will be the trick, I think, in drafting it. But again, there are, and we will hit later, some of the legislation that's been filed for the 2019 regular session of the legislature. On burden of proof, we've already, Mr. Reed's already talked about that. We need to go through the current ordinances along with our bylaws and be very clear that we are consistent throughout. I think there are a couple of inconsistencies in the way things are written. At one point, the commission was very interested in pushing the burden. The prior commission was very interested in pushing the burden of proof a little higher. We have obviously been interested in keeping the burden of proof a little bit lower. But the key thing here is a comprehensive review of every place that there's a burden of proof mentioned, from our policies to the ordinances to the laws that DOA has to follow and court opinions that DOA has to follow to make sure that we are consistent throughout. On voting, there was a proposal that the mayor and city commission ought to have to vote on issues unless they are prohibited by law from voting, with some idea that, and this could be by ordinance or could be by policy, that if a member takes a walk on a vote, now, I don't know where the members of this board would want to draw the line, but if a member gets up, walks out of the room for 5 minutes for a particular vote and walks back in, should they be required to file something with the city treasurer clerk to say how they would have voted? That might be handled one way. On the other hand, if somebody's out having a emergency appendectomy and they miss the whole meeting, that's not taking a walk as a convenience to not have to record their vote. So somewhere in there is something that has been raised before this board as giving the public a fair representation of what their elected officials are really up to. I see Ms. Graham is on this one.
In Congress, if you missed a vote for whatever reason, I'm very proud. I didn't miss many, I think 2 total. It always was inherent upon the member, I felt, to go to the well and say what you would have voted if you had been there.
Right. I know
so as not to avoid being recorded on the record on the issue.
The legislature has a process where if you miss a vote, you just go up to the secretary of clerk's desk and you fill out a form, and you can either vote late or you can actually change your vote as long as it does not affect the outcome of the measure. So if it was a 60 to 59 vote and you go up and change your yes to a no, you're not allowed to do that in the Florida legislature, which would be something else we might want to consider, whether the form that says, does it say this is how I vote, or does it say this is how I would have voted had I been in the room?
Well, I think the problem we're running into is that there's a question mark. Why was he or she absent for that vote? Why? Right. So raises ethical questions.
Compensation. This proposal would say that elected officials and their personal staffs, any change in their compensation should be prospective only. We learned early on in the existence of this board there were some issues that happened before the board existed where benefits, I won't say compensation, but benefits, primarily retirement benefits, were changed retroactively to the benefit of a commissioner or two, and that was an issue that I remember the board members were got some anxiety over, but again, it wasn't within our jurisdiction. But the idea that at least for those elected officials and their more political staff, you ought not to be able to reach backwards. If you've got a great manager or a great person working in whichever department of the city and you want to go back and make their raise retroactive to the first of the month, that's different than it probably is for the elected types, which was the genesis of this particular recommendation. But again, we can go as broad or narrow as the board wants to go. On nepotism, something that would track the state law, which excludes a wide variety of relatives. I think there are about 17 people on the list, from your parents to your stepchildren and half-brothers and half-sisters, as being included within the nepotism prohibition, and also to disclose relationships so that there may be perfectly legitimate, somebody may be a manager in one part of the city and their son or daughter gets a part-time job working as a lifeguard. I don't think anybody's going to get too upset about that, but just a process to disclose all of those things, all of those relationships on a periodic basis, so that if anything does look inappropriate, it can be handled quickly, and if anyone complains about it after the fact, it's not a gotcha. Somebody can say, well, we disclosed that. Everybody knew about it, and Joe over here in this department had no effect on his daughter's ability to get hired. He didn't talk to any of those people. That becomes part of the culture. The City Commission has already done this. They've expanded their comment period. We heard numerous times in here complaints that people were not allowed to speak at City Commission meetings, or time was cut off, or 5 people wanted to talk on the same subject and didn't feel that they were given adequate time, or there were 30 people there to comment and the City Commission said collectively we're taking 30 minutes of comments. And when we run out of that 30 minutes, whoever hadn't spoken just doesn't get to speak. They've already done some of that, so I don't know if we keep this on the list or not. Outsourcing. The idea, and this is something we raised a couple of years ago, if a function of the city is outsourced, particularly a governmental type function of the city is outsourced, and this board has jurisdiction over city employees, does the board's jurisdiction then extend to the employees of that outsourced entity that is being funded 100% with public dollars? So you see that in communities when, for instance, they do all of their waste collection with public employees and public equipment, and then they outsource that, and suddenly the public has no real place to complain because it's a contract matter rather than an ethics matter. Mr. Payne?
I will say that in the state agency that I just retired from, that is a standard, that all contract workers abide by the same restrictions.
Right. So this, if the board wanted to broaden this, it might relate to any city service that's contracted out, or it could be made prospective only to say anything that the city's currently doing with employees and decides later to do with a private vendor. There's a couple of ways to skin this cat, and we would want some input on that. Ms. Graham?
No, I was just saying, this is minor, but outsourcing, OUTSOURCING, just change that in the, wherever it's electronically held.
Thank you.
No worries. I do a lot of editing. I see things like that.
Well, then you get Ms. Phillips' job. We had a. Okay. We had a prior board member who kept us straight.
It's a skill set I have. I see everything.
Thank you. Thank you.
No worries.
We will need lots of that. And obviously, we mean this different from true privatization, where the city simply stops doing something, and private enterprise picks up that activity, and it's not done with private dollars. That would be a different thing. But this would be where the city and the taxpayers are still paying for the service. Databases. This could be, again, a policy that the city would adopt, but it basically would just say we'd like to have a public database of city contractors and vendors to know, so that any member of the public could look up. And this came, I think, actually from one of those public records requests where somebody was trying to figure out who was authorized by the city to do certain things. So rather than have to make a public records request, you could just go to a website and find out who the city has signed contracts with. G is definitely a policy issue, and that is to include something ethics related in the interview process. And that might apply not only to hiring, but also something in the contracting process, to at least make sure that contractors know what the city ethics code is and the requirements of the code as it may relate, hopefully expanded, to the contractor's activities. Organizational values, this fits in with the programmatic audit on ethics. But the city has some organizational values, and we have had, I forget who made this recommendation, somebody suggested they thought that the idea of ethics could be raised in the city's published organizational values to a higher position.
And there's a typo there, too. It should say make ethical service an organizational value. I have public service there. So that's another typo.
So public becomes ethical?
Yep.
The gifts here is a repeat. Contracts, make contracts voidable if it is found after that a provision, it would have to go in the contract, in the procurement process, but a contract would be voidable if it was determined that the awarding of the contract was influenced by or attempted to be influenced by a prohibited gift from the entity that won the contract. So that there is a tail on that behavior, that if you do something that's inappropriate and subsequently sign the contract, right now it kind of looks like you've got a get-out-of-jail-free card. There was a thought by the person who proposed this that inappropriate behavior ought to follow and ought to put the contract at risk as a way to try to change the environment. K is a repeat. This is drawn from a couple different documents, so forgive the repeats. On L, I think we had actually determined that we thought we could live within our existing resources. This would be something I would leave this really to Ms. Meadows Keefe and Ms. McNeil, who's been our budget person, to look at. We have had our budget so far has been adequate for our needs, and since this is a non-recurring expenditure, it might be something we could handle within our current budget. Ms. Graham, this one's right up your alley. Provide more targeted ethics education to various departments and leadership, and I think you would want to add here, and to the community.
Mm-hmm. Do we have, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, do we have social media platforms? Do we do any of that?
Ms. Meadows Keefe?
The City Commission has a great social media presence through Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. The challenge for this particular board and similar boards for something like Facebook is comments and having to respond to comments and things that may get posted that may or may not be appropriate, may relate to complaints that are unfounded. So although I love that idea, I think board council and some other jurisdictions might need to be consulted. There are some situations where it's been successfully done, like the New York City Board of Ethics has a great social media platform, but they just push out tweets. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be okay. Facebook may be something else. So I think it's trying to walk a fine line between public engagement and that dialogue, and then public records, and then having to respond to comments. I think there's a Facebook function where you can actually turn comments off, and it's strictly a platform for communication.
Okay, so Ms. Meadows Keefe, let's explore that more specifically. I think the concerns previously when we've talked about that were that we wanted to be able to push information out, but we didn't necessarily want a flood of information coming in from worldwide anonymous sources on anything. That our hotline works pretty well. Obviously, we get calls and we get emails through that, and it has been controllable so far. There was some concern that we would get, and we do periodically get calls from other jurisdictions where they say, my city commissioner just did this, and so they complain to us because we're the closest thing to a city ethics board that they can find online, but their city happens to be 100 miles away. So we already deal with that some.
You think that's outside our jurisdiction? That's a joke. That was a joke.
I use it as a way to educate Board Member Graham that we have it, and maybe you want to suggest this for your locality, and here's how you do it. Right. I send people to Mr. Wilcox.
And I would refer you to what's going on in Naples right now, where they had a citizen-initiated charter amendment to create an ethics board, and they are in litigation. Mr. Reed.
I just want to make a quick comment regarding the social media issue, because I think it's important to point out if there is a comment section, there's one pitfall that those subject to the Sunshine Law need to be aware of, is if a member of the board were to comment on that, it could create a meeting scenario that would violate the Sunshine Law. Recently in the city of Miami Beach, the city commissioner posted an issue that had previously come before the board but had the remote possibility of returning to the board. Another city commissioner then later posted just his 2 cents on it, and it raised concerns to be a Sunshine Law. So if this were an avenue to pursue, I would definitely consider turning off the comment section. Another issue that's probably unique to us, that not so much to other governments, is we do have issues that are confidential in nature. If somebody were to comment and they knew something that we didn't want the public to know, that could create a confidentiality issue as well.
Thank you for that. I think I'm more thinking into the future in terms of informing the people of Tallahassee. I didn't use that word that starts with a C because I obviously can't say it. Citizenry. Citizenry? How do you say that word? Someone help me out.
Population.
Citizenry.
Citizenry.
Citizenry. Yes. But just so that once we are at the point where we have a new ethics order and what we're operating under, that the people of Tallahassee are as familiar with it as they can be, so they understand what we're here, what our purpose is, what our jurisdiction is, what we can actually hear, what we could act upon. I do think that based on my limited experience, which has just been on the board for a couple months now, there seems to be a misunderstanding of what everyone's nodding, but what our role is and what we can actually act upon. And I understand there's a frustration that develops as a result of that by the people of Tallahassee.
I think you're absolutely right.
Mr. Chairman, I did want to comment that there is currently a lot of good information on the TalGov website on the ethics, a published ethics guide, and a lot of good information that
We can refer to.
yeah, so we have more control over that than over public comment.
And one of the things we talked about once in the past that we have not done is going out and actually paying somebody to help us make our little piece of the internet more friendly. I think probably all the members of the board get on the ethics portion of the City of Tallahassee website. And it's usable, but it is not always perfect. There are things that could stand to be updated. There are things that could be posted more predominantly. There might be a way to have the hot issue of the month kind of situation where you have the headlines at the top, rather than right now the headlines tend to be 4 layers deep. That might be money well spent, and I have to believe in a town with as many college students and college professors as we have, there have to be people who can do that stuff in their sleep. So that might be something that we would take on as a recommendation to ourselves to pursue.
They talk about that in national seminars as branding. They actually say branding of ethics programs and with a consistent theme so that it catches on.
Related to all of that is the next item, which is enhancing our video and online education to include additional modules. We'd like to take some of the kinds of things that Ms. Meadows-Keefe has done, or some of the things that we have done in board meetings. Certainly, if we get expanded jurisdiction, a couple of brief videos, whether they're us or whether they're we go out and hire somebody who is well-spoken and photogenic. Not that the members of the board aren't, but somebody who kind of does that sort of thing professionally, to do a handful of videos that are short and watchable and maybe get some attention. Campaign contribution refund program, we've had very little use of that program. We have done some marketing with candidates at the time of qualification, but we've actually seen very few people seeking refunds. I think the original purpose of the refund program was to try to get voters more involved, thinking if more people make those small contributions, they will be more involved in the political process and more knowledgeable voters. So some outreach on our part to promote that, which again would be spending some small amount of money, but that is one, not probably a recommendation to the City Commission, but a recommendation by us to us. And the last is the audit, which Ms. McNeil has covered. Again, you will see you have the City of Tallahassee Supplemental Ethics Policy, Tallahassee Reformers United for Ethics, True Coalition, that is Dr. Jackson's materials from 2012. And you have that short list, a draft that I had done. And then I would refer you quickly, and if you want, we can email this out, but the 2019 legislature will consider House Bill 1, which limits candidates' appearances in public service announcements from the date of qualification through Election Day if the PSA is paid for with public funds. It defines employment contracts to include all public officers and employees rather than just employees of an agency, and say that they may not have an employment or a contract that creates a recurring conflict between private interests and public duties, and requires them to disclose any offers of such employment or contract. It prohibits statewide officers or legislators or candidates from soliciting employment offers or investment advice that are related to their official duties, except during their last 180 days in office, when obviously they're moving on to their next job. It requires employment disclosure or offers of employment to be disclosed if they come from state agencies or anybody who receives an appropriation, if those offers are made because of the person's official duties, or the officers are made by a lobbyist or principal of a lobbyist. And it requires non-elected state officers and employees to file financial disclosures, who file financial disclosures to negotiate future employment or contractual relationships with restricted employers more than 90 days from the end of or the termination of their public employment. House Bill 439 prohibits the Commission on Ethics from this is something that's in our bylaws, by the way, prohibits the Commission on Ethics from publicly releasing notification of probable cause finding on a complaint within the 60 days immediately preceding an election if the complaint involves a candidate, to avoid ethics complaints being made as an attempt to influence elections, and makes the same prohibition related to probable cause findings of the Florida Elections Commission during that kind of 60-day freeze period right before the election. Senate Bill 7040 requires the Commission on Ethics to procure an electronic filing system for financial disclosures by January of 2020, requires Form 6 filers, elected officials, to file electronically by 2022, and requires people like us, the Form 1 filers, to file electronically by 2023. So for some of you will still be on this board in 2023, and your Form 1 financial disclosure will get filed electronically. And last, House Bill 9 relates to community redevelopment agencies, an issue we've talked about pretty much consistently at our meetings. Requires ethics training for commissioners, procedures for appointing board members, a referendum to create a CRA, limits procurement procedures, has a number of reports, particularly to identify inactive CRAs, has limits on setting the level of tax increment financing, and has additional requirements for audits. So that's what the Florida legislature is looking at. And Mr. Baines, I'm going to recognize you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, board members. Curtis Baines, 1323 East Tennessee Street. In December of last year, I saw a document that had been published in the Tallahassee Democrat and also the Tallahassee report. It looks like the same document, so I'm sure it's an accurate representation of whatever is in someone's file, but it's not from anyone, it's not to anyone, but it concerns a particular accusation against a city commissioner. It's from February, almost 5 years ago now. And basically what it's showing is city attorney and city manager and all these different people running around trying to investigate the issue. On June 30th, I appeared before the city commission. I told them that this is an indication that the city does not have a policy with respect to this kind of information. And I told them at that point, and in my memo of February the 7th to you, I illustrated that this is something that needs to be resolved. There are three ways of doing it. You can put it in the charter, you can put it in an ordinance, or you can put it in a board policy. I think we don't necessarily need to go to the charter at this point, but I think it would be better presented in an ordinance that would require anyone receiving this kind of information. I don't want them to have an option on what to do when they get this information. I want them to have a duty to report it to the ethics board. It's not an option as, well, let's check into this and let's do that and let's go over here and do that. But it puts a duty on the employee or on the commissioner or on the appointed officer, whoever gets the information, to pass that information along in the form of a report to the board, or a complaint or an allegation, however you want to set it up. But now, part of that is contingent upon a couple of other things that we've been talking about over the last couple of years. And number one is to have a comprehensive ethics ordinance, not one where if it's this issue, you take it to the state, and if it's this issue, we may be able to handle it, that this body have comprehensive authority to investigate any allegation of what I had in the memo indicated, Part 3, Chapter 112, but it could be any issue that's involving some ethical lapse. And that you would investigate that independently, not referring it to city managers or city attorneys or city auditors or anyone else, but that you have the duty to investigate that complaint. So I wanted to make sure that when you're putting your blue sky ordinance together, that you certainly expand the jurisdiction, but not just to the city, but to any dependent board or district, like the Downtown Improvement Authority. It's a dependent district in the city. So it should apply to them as well, and any other districts there that may exist with any other dependent districts that the city may have. That there, a couple of years ago, I guess it was last year when we were having this, one of the questions came up about, well, people were concerned about double jeopardy. So, they don't want to have to deal with it here and deal with the state. So we set up some mechanism that we can go one way or the other, but not both. We're not, the purpose of this is not to permanently harass employees who may have made a mistake doing something. The third thing is that it create an affirmative duty to report allegations. If this information and these requirements had been in place last year, I don't think we would have been in a position where we had to pay a golden parachute to someone who was violating this. They would have had an affirmative duty to report. And if they didn't, then that's grounds for dismissal right there. And then, of course, we need to go back and bolster our investigative abilities within the ethics board. Thank you.
Okay. Let's do this. Something the new board members would not know this, but we have had in the past a suggestion that we simply suggest to the city commission that they adopt the state ethics law and within our jurisdiction. What they have done kind of I won't say in response to that, but what they've done along those lines is said that by ordinance, we may not investigate any issue that is before the State Commission on Ethics, which of course there's no way for us to know because the State Commission on Ethics, as would we, close holds the complaints and the names of the persons complained about until they have made their initial, sometimes final determination. But where we know that they're investigating, we're prohibited by the ordinance from doing an investigation, even if it was a violation of the ordinance. So let's ask Mr. Reed if for the next meeting when we'll have some draft language for you, just to have a simple adoption of the state ethics law, an ordinance that simply says that, along with the, we won't duplicate if we know they're doing it provision to avoid it isn't really double jeopardy. People who don't like the idea, and I know you know that, but people who don't like the idea of being investigated by two different entities like to call it double jeopardy, but I think as the lawyers in the room would recognize, it is not. But we will have on these issues, at a minimum, we will have draft language for you at the next meeting. I encourage you to think about them, to think about anything else that you want added, and in particular on these issues, going back, Mr. Payne, to your issue of to whom ought they apply. Think about, maybe zero gifts applies to everybody. Maybe misuse of position applies to management and up. I don't know where the sweet spots are on that, or maybe it ought to be to any city employee or any vendor or any contract employee on all of them. How broad or how narrow do we want to go? I don't think we are trying to be soft on any of these things, but we want, I think, to make sure that we propose an ethics ordinance that is ultimately workable and that captures any truly bad behavior and is a huge disincentive to people. That's the bigger issue to me is just, it'd be nice if we never had a complaint, a valid complaint, because there never was anything to complain about. That said, we are at 7:01. On the agenda, any public comments on non-agenda items? Our next public meeting is Tuesday, March 19th from 4 to 7 in this same location. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Jackson. I did not.
And really,
if you were a little taller, I'd be able to see you.
And that's why I sit in the front so you can see me. Just a quick question. What happens with criminal issues? If you have city employees over the last 8-9 years, citizens will call and tell me about ethical issues. They'll tell me about what they think are criminal issues. The whole last 8 years of chasing Scott Matty, we found out there was a few criminal issues, about 44 of them. So is there some way to take what Mr. Baines is saying, but I think it also, if you have a city employee, if they think not only it's unethical what's going on, but if they also feel it may be criminal, well, both of those should be referred to this commission. Not that you're going to investigate criminal, but they should have a responsibility to tell somebody, where do I go? Because I'm trying to get out of the business, and I like to have someone else for them to talk to. And that's one thing. I think we ought to include criminal.
And we do have an opinion from a prior board attorney that if we get an allegation of illegal behavior, we have as a board an obligation to pass it along to the state attorney or to law enforcement. That's right. Not it. It's not discretionary with us. Excellent. We may choose to pursue an ethical aspect of it, but we have the obligation to do that.
Absolutely. But my point is that should be shared and educated as you were talking about in this whole process. So that's one thing. The penalties, I haven't looked through, and I apologize, all those 4-page draft, I didn't see it out here and I didn't print it off, but I was very encouraged by all the list of items that you have, that you were bringing up, so that's a positive thing for sure. I would also think that as far as the penalties, like I always say, there's something wrong when I spend more money tracking down Rick Fernandez, doing the investigation, hiring people to help me, hiring attorneys, and then I'm spending $15,000, and then he gets a penalty of $6,000. Okay, the $6,000 is not going to affect someone who's making $240,000 a year, plus benefits, plus this, plus whatever he's making on the side, being a crook. So the penalties are a real problem. I would also suggest you include, as you just mentioned, I believe, we have penalties for contractors, okay? You shouldn't be rewarding contractors that have had legal problems in the past. For example, several years ago, probably 7 or 8, there was a group here in town called Knowles, Randolph, and Marks. And I came out and I brought out information about the $1 million in federal contracts that John Marks gave to his law partner, Harold Knowles. Well, we have Pinnacle Construction that Harold Knowles got started. Another way to take money from John Marks, fund it through his Pinnacle Construction, and that's how the payoffs go back and forth. It makes it really hard to point. A couple weeks ago, I just learned that American Express has just filed a lawsuit against Harold Knowles and a city contractor, Pinnacle Construction, for not paying approximately $648,000 that they owe to American Express. Now, that lawsuit's been filed here a week or so ago. If there's a local company that loses, a city contractor that is found guilty of doing that, then we shouldn't be doing business with that person. Harold Knowles was a city attorney representing the county. He was also, he was an attorney representing the county. He was also representing many boards within the city. Okay? So if you have legal problems, that should prevent them from working with the city or a local government. Let's see what else I have here. There's several things. I did read this memorandum that you had the charter authority. There are some examples. For example, misuse of position. When you're writing these drafts, I would make it a kind of a dummy proof. Make it as easy as possible. For example, in the ordinance under misuse of position, it says city official employees who use his or her public position for more than, quote, minimal private benefit. Don't put that in there. If you have attorneys, though, how are you going? What does that mean? How are you going to prove minimal private benefit for any benefit? Okay, make it simple to understand. You talk about gifts, and I know you were talking about 0 on gifts. If that's how it's worded, that'd be great. But in this one, which was from Palm Beach County, it talks about giving gifts, quote, when those gifts can be perceived as influencing official behavior. No, don't put that in there. That's just something else we can fight over, and you'll never be able to prove that. What is what's influencing official behavior? You'll never know. If you take a bottle of water, and if you didn't pay for it, if you don't already own it, and someone gives you something, you just say no. You got to make it simple for city employees, and that's how I run my personal business, and I think the city ought to follow suit. Make it easy to and clear for city employees, because they're in a bind if they see other people taking tickets and gifts and extra money and deferred comp and sending city employees out. And I just talked to rebuild a house for Fernandez. No one's looked into that yet. Now, FDLE is looking into it, and hopefully they'll get to that. So several issues. We had one of the ethics commissioners asked two things. My complaint, ethics complaint that I filed against Andrew Gillum. The final hearing is scheduled for April 23rd through 25th, so that I have 3 days of learning a few things, which I think the FBI will be glad to hear what they find out. And in my lawsuit regarding the Florida Sunshine, where I sued the city, we've appealed that, and my response, the city's response, will be this Friday, and we've asked for that to be expedited, and so we're making headway there. Try to help out wherever I can. Thank you so much.
Mr. Smith.
Just have one question.
Dr. Jackson, you're back on.
This is great. No one's ever asked me a question in almost 9 years. I like this guy.
It's a moment of
you want to have a question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You said legal problems, people with legal problems shouldn't be working with the city. Do you mean someone who's been convicted of something, or just even going through an allegation or anything?
No, not allegations. No, not allegations. But, for example, right now, I think it would be bad if you guys turn around and give a contract to Rick Fernandez. I think that's probably a bad idea. I think that if Andrew Gillum comes up here, or if Scott Maddox wants a contract, I think you ought to say no. I think if you have a contract with Pinnacle Construction, with Harold Knowles, then I think I wouldn't be approving any contracts. So if anything, if he's found to have acted unethically previously, then let's don't bring him back.
I think that would fit right in with what we talked about on having an ethics element in city procurement and city contracts, that might expand to,
correct.
Have you ever been the recipient of the non-ethics award?
Right. Oh, and then since, and last little thing on Mr. Reed, when I talked about you being a lobbyist, I don't know, we've never met, but the research that I've done and people that I've hired, they also said that you were lobbyists for trial lawyers and also lobbyists for gambling interests. So that's the basis in which I made my comment. Okay, thank you so much.
And, Mr. Reed, if in drafting, if you would take, and this is for Ms. Meadows-Keefe and me too, if we would all take particularly to heart in drafting the idea that if there are any phrases that are in the draft ordinances that are subject to interpretation, let's make an effort to define those phrases. We've done that in the past, like on our last recommendation on misuse of position, we had a whole page of definitions. We need to move quickly. Mr. Reed.
Okay, just to piggyback on Dr. Jackson's point, the issue of if a criminal issue is raised to the board, the charter and the ordinance do not mandate us to act, but however, in our bylaws, in the board's bylaws, Article 3, Section D, Paragraph 1 defines the responsibilities and duties of this board, and D does mandate that we report any ethics or corruption matters to the appropriate law enforcement agency when violations of criminal law is indicated. So there is currently a provision that provides that.
And Ms. Meadows-Kiefer, our last comment.
Finally, there was a document, we didn't go over it, but it is the report portion of what's going to be our report and recommendations. It's the last item, I think, in your notebook, and it gives an overview of what was done in 2018 up to now. It's going to be part of what hopefully we will approve at the next meeting. So if you all can review that with any comments, and if you want to send your comments to me, I could incorporate them in the draft, so that way we're like halfway done with the letter by the time we get to the meeting next month.
Okay, and with apologies, Ms. Graham, anything?
No, I just wanted to, the letter you're referring to, are we going to have enough board members and quorum in order to proceed with that letter? Yes, okay, just want to confirm.
We should.
You have a sense of urgency.
Okay, I've already announced when our next meeting is. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Farmer, and the folks in the back. Thank you for hanging with us late, and we are adjourned.